At 7:15 in the evening on May 2nd, 1878, 18 men were doing what they did every single day. They were grinding wheat into flour inside the largest flour mill on the planet, the Washburn A Mill in Minneapolis, Minnesota. 6 stories of limestone and timber filled with machinery that never stopped running. None of them heard the spark. What they heard, what the entire city heard, was the sound of the atmosphere itself ripping apart. In less than 2 seconds, the Washburn A Mill ceased to exist. Not collapsed, not burned, vaporized. The explosion was so violent that it created a pressure wave strong enough to shatter windows a mile away, strong enough to knock people off their feet in downtown Minneapolis, strong enough to ignite 4 adjacent flour mills in a chain reaction that turned 6 city blocks into a crater of flame and rubble. 18 men died instantly. Some of their bodies were never found, not because they were buried under debris, but because they had been atomized by the blast itself. The force was later calculated to be equivalent to 14 tons of TNT, all of it triggered by flour, white, harmless, everyday flour. And here is the part that should haunt you. Every single miller in Minneapolis knew this could happen. They had known for years. They had watched smaller explosions kill their friends. They had breathed in the white dust that coated their lungs and hung in the air thick enough to taste. And they walked into those mills anyway, because the flour had to be ground, and the money had to be made, and America was hungry. This is the story of how flour dust became more explosive than gunpowder. How one catastrophic night in Minneapolis killed 18 workers and destroyed 5 mills, and how the ashes of that disaster built an empire that still feeds the world today. You know their names: Pillsbury, General Mills, Gold Medal Flour. They all trace their origins back to one thing: the explosion that nobody could ignore. Let us go back to the beginning. By 1878, Minneapolis was not just a city, it was a machine. A machine designed for one purpose and one purpose only: turning wheat into flour faster and cheaper than anywhere else on Earth. The city sat at the edge of St. Anthony Falls, the only major waterfall on the entire Mississippi River. That falling water represented something almost impossible to comprehend in the 19th century: free, unlimited, perpetual power. While factories in the East burned through mountains of coal and paid dearly for every ton, Minneapolis had a power source that never ran out and never sent a bill. The falls dropped 50 feet in a quarter mile of river. Engineers calculated the force at nearly 100,000 horsepower during peak flow, enough to run every mill in New England combined, enough to grind every bushel of wheat the Great Plains could produce, enough to make whoever controlled that waterfall unimaginably wealthy. The men who recognized this opportunity built their empires literally on the riverbank. They dug canals to channel the water. They constructed massive stone mills that shook with the force of turbines spinning day and night. They bought up wheat from farmers across Minnesota, the Dakotas, and Manitoba. And they turned Minneapolis into the flour capital of the world. By the spring of 1878, Minneapolis was producing more flour than any other city in America. The railroad had transformed what was possible. Wheat that once rotted in prairie fields could now reach Minneapolis mills within days of harvest. And flour that once fed only local markets could now ship to New York, Chicago, even across the Atlantic to Liverpool and London. The flour barons of Minneapolis were not gentlemen farmers playing at industry. They were ruthless capitalists engaged in a war of production. And no battlefield in that war was more important than the block of mills along the west bank of the Mississippi, where Cadwallader Washburn and Charles Pillsbury faced each other like generals across a line of scrimmage. Cadwallader Colden Washburn built the mill that bore his name. His name sounds like something out of a Dickens novel, and in many ways his story reads like one. Born in Maine in 1818, he was the 7th of 11 children, raised in poverty that he spent his entire life trying to escape. He worked as a surveyor in Iowa and Wisconsin, tramping through frontier wilderness to map land that speculators would sell to settlers. He studied law at night by candlelight, passed the bar, and built a practice representing those same speculators in property disputes. He invested his earnings in land, timber, and railroads. By his 40s, he was wealthy. By his 50s, he was rich. The Civil War made him a general. He commanded Wisconsin volunteers and earned a reputation for competence, if not brilliance. After the war, his constituents elected him to Congress, then made him governor of Wisconsin. He could have retired to politics, comfortable and respected. But Cadwallader Washburn wanted more. He wanted to build something that would outlast him, something that would carry his name into the future. And in the 1870s, the future was flour. Washburn understood something that many industrialists of his era missed. The future belonged to scale. If you could build a mill twice as large as your competitor, you could produce flour at half the cost per barrel. And if you could do that, you could crush every small miller in the region and dominate the market. So in 1874, he built the Washburn A Mill, 6 stories tall, solid limestone walls nearly 3 feet thick, the largest flour mill ever constructed on American soil. It could produce 3,000 barrels of flour per day. That is over 1 million pounds of flour every 24 hours. His rival Charles Pillsbury watched the construction from across the river and seethed. Pillsbury had come to Minneapolis from New Hampshire in 1869 with nothing but ambition and borrowed money. He had built his own milling empire through relentless work and shrewd dealing. But Washburn's new mill threatened to make Pillsbury's operations obsolete overnight. The Washburn-Pillsbury rivalry drove both men to dangerous extremes. When Washburn increased production, Pillsbury matched him. When Pillsbury cut prices, Washburn cut deeper. Each man pushed his mills harder, his workers longer, his machinery faster. Safety was a luxury neither could afford. Whoever slowed down first would lose everything. The Washburn. A mill ran around the clock, 3 shifts of workers feeding wheat into machines that never stopped grinding. The noise inside was deafening. The massive millstones, some weighing over a ton, spun at hundreds of revolutions per minute, pulverizing hard spring wheat into fine white powder. The building vibrated constantly, a low hum you could feel in your teeth if you stood close enough. And everywhere, coating every surface, filling every breath, was the dust. If you have never worked in a flour mill, you cannot imagine what it was like to spend 12 hours inside one. The air was not air. It was a suspension of particles so thick that you could not see clearly across a room. The white powder coated your eyelashes, filled your nostrils, worked its way into every fold of your clothing. Workers emerged at the end of their shifts looking like ghosts, white from head to toe, coughing up paste. The dust got into everything, into their lungs, where it accumulated over years until some men could barely breathe, into their food, coating the sandwiches they ate on their short breaks, into their homes, where their wives would shake out their work clothes and watch clouds of white settle on the floor. There was a name for the chronic respiratory problems that plagued flour mill workers. They called it miller's lung. We would call it occupied lung disease. It killed slowly, over decades, stealing breath 1 grain at a time. But the slow death was not what the workers feared most. They feared the flash. Every experienced miller had seen it happen. A pocket of flour dust, suspended in the air at just the right concentration, where it would catch a spark from somewhere, a stone grinding against metal, a gear slipping, a lantern placed too close to a dust cloud. The flash was almost beautiful for a split second. A bloom of orange light that spread outward through the room. Then came the heat. Small flashes left men with burned faces and singed hair. Larger ones sent workers to the hospital with severe burns over their bodies. The hospital in Minneapolis knew flour mill injuries the way combat hospitals know bullet wounds. They saw them constantly, and yet the workers kept coming. Immigrants from Sweden, from Germany, from Ireland, from French Canada. Men who had fled poverty and famine and oppression, only to find themselves breathing explosive powder in a wooden building for 12 hours a day. The mills paid better than most alternatives. $1.50 a day, sometimes $2 for experienced men. Enough to rent a room, feed a family, put away a little money for the future that 18 of them would never see. To understand what happened on May 2nd, 1878, you first need to understand what flour actually is. More importantly, you need to understand what it becomes when you turn it into dust and suspend it in air. Flour is mostly starch. Starch is mostly carbon. And carbon, under the right conditions, burns. You know this intuitively. You have seen campfires. You have watched logs turn to ash. Carbon combustion is one of the oldest chemical reactions humans have ever used. But here is what makes flour dust different from a log. Surface area. A log burns slowly because fire can only reach its outer surface. The interior of the log is protected, so combustion happens gradually. Okbaos, from the outside in. The larger the log, the slower the burn. But flour dust has no interior. Each particle is so small, often less than 1/100th of a millimeter in diameter, that it is essentially all surface. When flour dust is suspended in air, every single particle is completely exposed to oxygen. There is nothing to slow the reaction down. The mathematics are terrifying when you work them out. A single pound of flour, spread evenly through a room as fine dust, has a total surface area of roughly half an acre. Imagine trying to burn half an acre of paper all at once. That is what happens when flour dust ignites. Give that dust a spark, just one tiny ignition point, and the combustion does not spread. It detonates. The first particle ignites and releases heat. That heat ignites every adjacent particle simultaneously. Those particles ignite the particles around them. The reaction propagates outward at hundreds of feet per second. In an enclosed space like a mill, the rapidly expanding gases have nowhere to go. Pressure builds until the weakest point fails. Usually that point is the roof. The explosion does not burn through a building the way fire does. It tears the building apart from the inside, converting the entire interior atmosphere into an expanding fireball that moves faster than human reaction time. You do not see it coming. You do not hear it coming. You are simply there, and then you are not. Modern safety engineers call this a dust deflagration. The minimum explosive concentration of wheat flour in air is approximately 40 grams per cubic meter. For comparison, coal dust requires about 55 grams. Flour is not just explosive. Flour dust is more explosive than coal dust by nearly a third. In 1878, they did not have these precise measurements. They just called it the milling curse, because it had happened before. Not at this scale, but enough times that every miller in Minneapolis understood the risk. Small fires were common. Flash burns from pockets of ignited dust sent men to the hospital regularly. In 1876, just 2 years before the Washburn disaster, a smaller explosion had killed several workers at a mill in the same district. The industry response was essentially a collective shrug. Dust was part of the job. Men died sometimes. Flour still had to be made. What nobody fully grasped was the relationship between mill size and explosion magnitude. The Washburn A mill was not just bigger than its predecessors, it was categorically different. More machinery meant more friction, meant more sparks. More production capacity meant more dust in the air. And that massive limestone shell, built to contain everything, would contain the explosion too. For about half a second, just long enough for the pressure to build to catastrophic levels. The Washburn A mill was not just a flour mill. It was a bomb, patiently waiting for someone to light the fuse. May 2nd, 1878 was a Thursday. Spring had finally arrived in Minneapolis after a brutal winter that had frozen the Mississippi solid for months. The temperature climbed into the 50s, and the sunset that evening painted the sky in shades of orange and pink above the river. After months of gray skies and bitter cold, the warmth felt like a blessing. Inside the Washburn A mill, the evening shift had been at work for several hours. 14 men moved through the building, tending the machinery, monitoring the flow of wheat and flour, breathing in the white powder that coated their clothes and skin and hair. The mill hummed with its constant vibration. The millstones turned. The wheat flowed down through the hoppers. The flour collected in bins on the lower floors, ready for bagging and shipping. Everything was exactly as it had been every day for 4 years. Everything was routine. We know some of their names. We should speak them. There was Axel Lindgren, a Swedish immigrant who had come to Minneapolis seeking the steady work that the flour mills promised. He had a wife and 3 children waiting for him at home. He had been a miller for 6 years. There was Patrick Mealy, an Irishman who had survived the famine as a child, and watching his neighbors starve while English landlords exported Irish grain. He had crossed an ocean to escape that horror, only to die in a grain explosion in a country that was supposed to be his new beginning. There was August Reinhold, a German miller who had learned his trade in the old country and brought those skills to the new world. His expertise with the machinery had earned him a supervisor's position and a slightly higher wage. There was Ole Thorstensen, barely 20 years old, who had arrived in Minneapolis 3 months earlier following cousins who had written home about opportunities in America. He was saving money to bring his younger brother over. The letter he had mailed that week would reach Norway 2 days after news of his death. 14 men in the Washburn mill, 4 more in the adjacent Diamond, Humboldt, and Zenith mills. 18 lives, most of them immigrants, most of them poor, all of them doing dangerous work because dangerous work was the only work available to men like them. At 7:15 p.m., something sparked. We will never know exactly what caused the ignition. The investigation afterwards suggested several possibilities. A millstone running dry and generating friction heat. A piece of metal striking another piece of metal inside the machinery. Static electricity discharging in the dust-choked air. A bearing overheating, a gear slipping. Any of these could have done it. All of them were happening constantly inside every flour mill in Minneapolis. What we know is this. At 7:15 p.m., a pocket of flour dust inside the Washburn mill encountered a source of ignition. The temperature required was only about 780 degrees Fahrenheit. A spark from a horseshoe on cobblestone reaches 1,500 degrees. The threshold was absurdly, tragically low. The first explosion began in the basement level, where the concentration of flour dust was highest. The pressure wave traveled upward through the building at roughly 1,100 feet per second, faster than the speed of sound. The men on the upper floors had approximately 1/20th of a second between the moment the explosion began and the moment it reached them. They felt nothing. They heard nothing. They simply ceased to exist as the building around them converted into expanding plasma and shrapnel. The limestone walls of the Washburn A mill, those 3-foot-thick walls designed to withstand anything, held together just long enough to amplify the disaster. They contained the initial explosion, and allowing the pressure to build far higher than it would have in a flimsier structure. Then they failed all at once, sending 1,000-pound blocks of stone flying hundreds of feet through the air. The roof of the mill rose into the sky like a cork from a champagne bottle. Witnesses described it as almost beautiful for a fraction of a second. A perfect rectangle of timber and slate suspended against the sunset, before gravity remembered its job and the debris began to fall. The Washburn A mill did not explode alone. Minneapolis in 1878 was a tightly packed industrial district. The major flour mills stood practically shoulder to shoulder along the riverbank, competing for access to the water power that drove their machinery. The Diamond Mill stood just 70 feet from the Washburn A. The Humboldt Mill was barely farther. The Zenith Mill was connected to the Washburn complex by a shared conveyor system. When the Washburn A detonated, it sent a pressure wave rippling outward through the district. That wave carried burning debris and, more importantly, burning flour dust. The same dust that filled the Washburn A filled every other mill on the waterfront. The air itself was flammable. The Diamond Mill exploded approximately 2 seconds after the Washburn A. 2 men inside died instantly. The Humboldt Mill ignited moments later. The Zenith Mill followed. Within 30 seconds of the initial blast, 5 flour mills were either destroyed or burning out of control. The chain reaction continued. Nearby warehouses filled with flour caught fire. The heat grew so intense that the Mississippi River itself seemed to boil where it ran past the destroyed mills. Timbers cracked and collapsed. Stone walls that had withstood decades of vibration from heavy machinery crumbled like sand castles. Firefighters who arrived on the scene described feeling the heat on their faces from blocks away. The glow of the fires could be seen from St. Paul, 10 miles distant. The column of smoke and flame rose hundreds of feet into the night sky, visible for 30 miles in every direction. The sound of the explosion reached every corner of Minneapolis. People described it as thunder that did not stop, as a physical force that pressed against their chests, as the voice of God pronouncing judgment on a city built on greed. Windows shattered in homes a mile from the blast. Horses bolted in their stalls, some breaking their legs in panic. Children woke screaming from sleep they had just fallen into. And in the Flour District, in the space where the Washburn A mill had stood minutes before, there was nothing but fire and rubble and silence. The silence was the worst part. Witnesses who rushed to the scene expecting to hear screams, expecting to hear cries for help, expecting to hear something, anything, human, found only the crackle of flames and the groan of collapsing structures. There were no survivors to rescue from the Washburn A mill. There were no wounded to carry to safety. There were only bodies to find, and precious few of those. Of the 14 men working in the Washburn A mill at the moment of explosion, only 8 were ever recovered in any identifiable form. The remaining 6 had been so completely destroyed by the blast that their remains could not be distinguished from the debris. Families buried empty coffins. Mothers mourned sons whose bodies had simply ceased to exist. The morning after revealed the scale of destruction in the harsh light of day. Where the Washburn A mill had stood, there was now a crater, not a ruin, not a collapsed building. A crater, as if a meteor had struck the riverbank. The limestone foundation, which had been sunk deep into the bedrock, was cracked and displaced. The machinery that had filled 6 stories of industrial space was scattered across blocks. Unrecognizable twisted metal mixed with shattered stone. Crowds gathered at the edge of the destruction zone, held back by hastily erected barricades. They stared at the crater in silence, trying to comprehend what they were seeing. Many of them had workers in their families. Many of them had walked past this mill just yesterday, right on their way to shops and offices and homes that were now covered in a fine layer of white dust that had once been the interior of 5 flour mills. 6 city blocks had been leveled, 5 flour mills destroyed, 18 men dead. Property damage estimates ran into the millions of dollars, an almost incomprehensible sum in 1878. Adjusted for inflation, the destruction would exceed $100 million today. The newspapers struggled to describe what had happened. "Horrible catastrophe," screamed the Minneapolis Tribune. "Terrible disaster at the Washburn A mill." The New York Times ran the story on its front page. The Chicago Tribune sent reporters on the first available train. For a few days, Minneapolis was the most talked about city in America, famous not for its flour, but for its dead. Cadwallader Washburn received the news at his home in La Crosse, Wisconsin. By all accounts, he was devastated. He traveled to Minneapolis immediately, walking through the ruins of his mill, staring at the crater that had been his greatest achievement. Whether his grief was primarily for the lost lives or the lost investment depends on which historical account you choose to believe. Probably both. Washburn was not a monster. He was an industrialist of his era, which means he occupied a moral space that modern sensibilities struggled to parse. He cared about his workers in the abstract while employing them in conditions that killed them in the specific. Charles Pillsbury, across the river, surveyed his own mills with new eyes. If it could happen to Washburn, it could happen to him. The same dust filled his buildings. So the same sparks flew from his machinery. The same workers breathed in the same explosive atmosphere. He had been lucky. That was all? Lucky? What happened next, however, would define both men's legacies far more than the disaster itself. The investigation into the Washburn. An explosion took months. Engineers and scientists examined every piece of evidence. They interviewed witnesses. They studied the physics of dust explosions in ways that had never been attempted before. And they reached a conclusion that should have been obvious but had somehow escaped the collective understanding of the entire milling industry. Flour dust explosions were not random accidents. They were predictable, preventable consequences of how flour was being made. The problem was the milling process itself. In 1878, most American flour mills used millstones to grind wheat. Massive circular stones rotating against each other, crushing the grain between them. This method was ancient, dating back thousands of years. It was also inherently dangerous. Millstones generated friction. Friction generated heat. Heat generated sparks. And the grinding process itself generated enormous quantities of fine dust that hung in the air for hours after production ended. Every flour mill using millstones was continuously generating both the fuel for an explosion and the ignition source to set it off. But there was an alternative. A new technology developed in Hungary and recently introduced to America that could grind flour without millstones. Instead of crushing grain between stones, this new process used steel rollers. The wheat passed between cylindrical rollers rotating at different speeds, which sheared the grain apart rather than pulverizing it. Roller milling had several advantages. It generated less heat, which meant fewer sparks. It produced less fine dust, which meant less explosive atmosphere. And it allowed millers to separate the different components of wheat more precisely, producing a finer, whiter flour that commanded premium prices. The technology also worked with a device called the Middlings Purifier, which used air currents to separate flour particles by size and weight. Combined with roller milling, the purifier allowed Minneapolis mills to produce a grade of flour that European mills could not match. White, fine, consistent flour that bakers across America would pay premium prices to obtain. The technology had been available for years. Most American millers had ignored it because their existing mills worked well enough and the capital investment required to switch was substantial. Why fix what is not obviously broken? 18 dead men provided the obvious breaking point. Cadwallader Washburn committed his fortune to rebuilding. Not just the Washburn A mill, but the entire concept of what a flour mill could be. He brought in engineers from Europe. He licensed patents for roller milling technology. He designed ventilation systems to prevent dust accumulation. He installed explosion-proof motors and spark-resistant machinery. He even commissioned new fire suppression systems that could detect and extinguish small fires before they could spread. The new Washburn A mill, completed in 1880, was the most advanced flour mill on Earth. It was also, for the first time in the history of Minneapolis milling, reasonably safe for the men who worked inside it, and it produced better flour. The roller milling process allowed Washburn to separate the wheat kernel into its component parts with unprecedented precision. The endosperm, which contains the starch, could be extracted cleanly from the bran and germ. The result was a pure white flour that bakers across America fell in love with. Washburn named it gold medal flour. You have seen it in grocery stores. You may have it in your kitchen right now. Every bag of gold medal flour traces its lineage directly back to the ashes of the men who died on May 2, 1878. Charles Pillsbury, watching from across the river, had no choice but to follow suit. If Washburn's new mills could produce better flour more safely, Pillsbury would be destroyed within years unless he matched that capability. The rivalry that had pushed both men toward disaster now pushed them toward innovation. The competition that had killed 18 men now saved thousands who would otherwise have died in future explosions. The Washburn disaster did not just change two companies, it changed an entire industry. Other millers across America watched Minneapolis rebuild and recognized what they were seeing. The new technology was not just safer, it was better. It produced superior flour at lower cost. The economics were undeniable. Within a decade, roller milling had completely replaced millstones in every major flour mill in America. Minneapolis, rather than declining after the disaster, exploded in growth. The new technology made the city's natural advantages even more valuable. The waterfall still provided free power. The railroad connection still brought wheat from across the Great Plains. And now, Minneapolis mills were producing the finest flour in the world. By 1890, Minneapolis was milling more flour than any other city on the planet. The Washburn-Crosby Company, which grew from Cadwallader Washburn's rebuilt empire, became one of the largest corporations in America. In 1928, it merged with several other milling companies to form General Mills. General Mills, Cheerios, Wheaties, Betty Crocker, Pillsbury, their longtime rival, which they eventually acquired in 2001. All of it traces back to the rebuilt mill on the Mississippi riverbank. All of it rises from the ashes of 18 men whose names most people have never heard. The disaster also changed how America regulated industrial safety. The Washburn explosion was not the first industrial disaster in American history, but it was among the most spectacular. It happened in a major city, killed workers in multiple facilities simultaneously, and demonstrated with undeniable clarity that certain industrial processes were simply too dangerous to leave unregulated. In the years following the explosion, Minneapolis and Minnesota implemented some of the first meaningful industrial safety codes in American history. Requirements for ventilation, standards for machinery maintenance, regulations about dust control. These rules spread to other states and eventually became the foundation for federal workplace safety laws. OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, did not exist until 1971, but its intellectual origins include the Washburn A mill explosion and the recognition that workers should not have to choose between employment and survival. If you go to Minneapolis today, you can still find the bones of this story. The Mill City Museum sits on the site of the original Washburn A mill complex. The ruins of the 1880 rebuilding, which itself suffered a devastating fire in 1991, have been preserved and incorporated into the museum architecture. You can walk through the stone shell of what was once the largest flour mill in the world. You can look up at walls that still bear the scorch marks of the 1991 fire and imagine the earlier inferno that killed 18 men. The museum tells the story of Minneapolis flour, milling with considerable honesty, the achievements and the atrocities, the innovation and the exploitation, the fortunes built and the lives destroyed. It is a memorial and a monument simultaneously, celebrating the industry that made Minneapolis while acknowledging the cost. There is an observation deck at the top of the museum ruins. From there, you can see the Falls of St. Anthony, still tumbling over the dam that channels their power. You can see the Mississippi River flowing past the former mill district, now transformed into parks and condominiums and trendy restaurants. The physical geography that made Minneapolis the flour capital of the world remains unchanged. Only the human activity has shifted. Stand there on a spring evening around 7:15 when the light is fading and the sky turns orange and pink. That is what those 18 men would have seen through the windows if they had looked up from their work in that last moment. A beautiful sunset over the river they had come from distant lands to work beside, and somewhere beneath that museum, beneath those parks, beneath those condominiums, are the remains of men whose bodies were never recovered, atomized in an instant, their molecules mixed with flour dust, and scattered across 6 city blocks, eventually settling into the soil that their labor had enriched. We owe them more than we can ever repay. Here is what I keep coming back to when I think about the Washburn A mill explosion. Every single person involved knew the danger. The workers knew flour dust could explode. They had seen it happen to friends and co-workers. The mill owners knew it. They had paid for hospital bills and funeral expenses after previous incidents. The engineers knew it. They understood the physics, even if they lacked precise measurements. The city officials knew it. They had received complaints and warnings for years. And yet the mills kept running. The dust kept accumulating. The workers kept breathing it in and walking past the sparking machinery and trusting that today would not be the day the atmosphere turned into fire. Why? Because the flour had to be made. Because the money had to be earned. Because America was hungry and Minneapolis had figured out how to feed it, and stopping was simply not an option that anyone with power was willing to consider. This is the pattern of industrial progress. We identify a need. We build systems to meet that need. We employ workers to operate those systems, and when those workers die, as they inevitably do, we express regret and make incremental improvements and keep the systems running. Because the need does not go away just because meeting it costs lives. The men who died in the Washburn A mill did not die for nothing. Their deaths forced changes that made flour milling dramatically safer. The technology developed in response to the disaster produced better flour at lower cost, feeding millions of people who would otherwise have gone hungry. The corporations built from the ashes of that explosion employ tens of thousands of people today. But none of that was inevitable. None of that was guaranteed. The disaster could have simply been a disaster, followed by more disasters, an endless parade of dead workers whose names history never recorded. What made the Washburn explosion different was the response. Cadwallader Washburn chose to rebuild better rather than simply rebuilding the same. The industry chose to adopt new technology rather than accepting continued casualties. The regulators chose to implement safety codes rather than shrugging at inevitable losses. Each of those choices could have gone differently. We know they could have gone differently because, in many industries, they did. The mines kept exploding, the factories kept maiming workers, the railroads kept crushing men between cars. Progress came slowly, grudgingly, paid for in blood until someone with power finally decided that blood was too expensive. The debt we owe to the dead is not just remembrance, it is the ongoing work of making sure their deaths meant something, of building systems that do not require human sacrifice to function, of valuing workers as more than disposable components in an industrial machine. We are still working on that. We have not finished. We may never finish. But every workplace safety regulation, every ventilation system, every spark-proof motor, every dust collection mechanism traces its lineage back to moments like May 2nd, 1878, back to men like Axel Lindgren and Patrick Mealy and August Reinhold and Ole Thorstensen, whose deaths finally made the powerful care about the powerless. The Washburn mill explosion lasted less than 2 seconds. In that eye blink of time, 18 men died, 5 mills vanished, 6 city blocks burned, and the entire trajectory of American industry shifted. Flour dust, white and fine and seemingly harmless, proved more explosive than gunpowder, more explosive than coal dust, and more deadly than anyone with the power to change things had been willing to admit. The companies that survived and adapted became some of the largest food corporations on Earth. The safety improvements developed in response became the foundation of workplace protection that workers still rely on today. The technology forced into existence by disaster transformed how America ate, and in Minneapolis, on the banks of the Mississippi, the ruins still stand, a memorial to ambition and negligence, a monument to progress and its price, a reminder that every bag of flour, every box of cereal, every loaf of bread carries within it the echo of an explosion and the ghosts of the men who made it possible. They deserved better. They got what the industrial age gave to working men: hard labor, low pay, and the chance to be atomized without warning when the profits demanded more production, and the dust hung thick in the air. Remember their names: Axel Lindgren, Patrick Mealy, August Reinhold, Ole Thorstensen, and the 14 others whose names we know, whose stories we have pieced together from immigration records and census data, and the grief of descendants who still carry their loss. Remember what they built: the industry that fed a growing nation, the city that rose from frontier outpost to milling capital, the technology that emerged from their destruction. Remember what destroyed them. Not just the spark, wherever it came from, but the system that made the spark inevitable, the calculation that weighed their lives against the cost of safety and found their lives cheaper. And the next time you open a bag of gold medal flour, take a moment to consider the metal's true cost. 18 men paid it on a Thursday evening in May, when the spark finally found the dust, and the largest flour mill on Earth became a crater in less time than it takes to draw a breath. Some debts can never be repaid. They can only be honored by remembering. Remember.